Welcome to Real Addiction Talk with your host, James Gibbons.
Welcome everybody to the second episode of Real Addiction Talk with your host, James Gibbons. I hope everybody had a wonderful Labor Day weekend. Depending on where you are, hopefully you had good weather. And looks like we begin our journey towards the fall season. But I do want to remind you that if you have not done so yet, check out our website at www.realaddictiontalk.com. Make sure you sign up for our newsletter for up-to-date research, content, education, and resources about our podcast and about addiction. Also, remember to like and follow our Facebook page at Real Addiction Talk. And feel free to post a comment or a question that you may have or a request that you'd like to see on our podcast. Today's episode is focused around the disease concept of addiction. And I actually just recently provided a presentation this week at a conference about this subject. And there were a lot of great questions at the end, and a lot of people who were at this conference, which were mostly addiction counselors or involved in some mental health aspect within the addiction field. But they had a lot of good questions, and a lot of them learned a lot. And one of the biggest things that we don't realize when we're dealing with an addiction is the disease concept of it all. So we have to understand that first if we're going to get better, if we're going to recover from this disease. And so the first thing I want to discuss is, what is a disease? Well, according to medical terms, a disease is, quote, a particular abnormal condition that negatively affects the structure or function of all or part of an organism, and that is not immediately due to any external injury. Diseases are often known to be medical conditions that are associated with specific signs and symptoms. Diseases can affect people not only physically, but also mentally, as contracting and living with a disease can alter the affected person's perspective on life. In a nutshell, there's really four big factors that makes a disease considered a disease. But before I get into that, I do want to provide some examples of diseases, in case you're not quite aware of a few. But Alzheimer's disease, Lyme's disease, cancer, heart disease, Parkinson's disease, arthritis, and the list goes on and on. And I was actually reading an article the other day about how many diseases there were back in 1870 something. And there were about 7 classified diseases back then. And now, currently, we have over 10,000 diseases. So let's get into the 4 big factors that makes up a disease. So the first thing is, a disease must be progressive, meaning over time the disease gets worse if it's not managed correctly. It's chronic. That's number 2, meaning it lasts forever. Number 3, it's incurable, so there is no cure for it. And number 4, it displays signs and symptoms. So how does that relate to addiction? Well, I'm going to go ahead and read you the quote of how the American Science of Addiction Medicine defines addiction. And they define it as the following, and I quote, "Addiction is a treatable chronic medical disease involving complex interactions among brain circuits, genetics, the environment, and an individual's self and life experiences. People with addiction use substances or engage in behaviors that become compulsive and often continue despite harmful consequences." Now, if you're currently listening to this and you have an active addiction, this probably hits home for you, right? Or even if you're in recovery, it probably hits home for you as well. I'm going to read that last part again. People with addiction use substances or engage in behaviors that become compulsive and often continue despite harmful consequences. So if we were to go back to the 4 factors that make up a disease, let's focus on how that relates to addiction. So the first one was progressive. So is addiction progressive? Well, yes, it is. It gets worse over time. Number 2, is it chronic? Yes, it lasts forever. Number 3, is it incurable? Absolutely, there is no cure for addiction. Despite all the books out there you might see at bookstores saying, the cure for addiction. I highly warn you to not buy those books. There is no cure. I don't foresee a cure anytime in the future. Number 4, does it display signs and symptoms? Absolutely. And we'll get into that here in a little bit. So addiction matched those 4 big factors of a disease. And alcoholism was actually first recognized as an illness in 1956 by the American Medical Association. And that's according to an article by the National Council of State Boards of Nursing. So a couple interesting facts for you of what happened in 1956. That was the first. That was the year that the first episode of this "As the World Turns" came out on TV, and that was also the first time we saw Elvis Presley live on TV, moving those hips. Addiction followed in 1987, and this was an important recognition because addiction encompasses all sorts of addictions, from smoking to substance use to other sorts of addictions such as gambling. And when it finally became a disease, that was a turning point as to where people could actually get some type of help with it through some type of provider. And I also want to make this pretty clear as well. And I read this in a book. I can't quite remember what the book was or who the author was, but I remember reading that there's a big difference between addiction and addiction. And you're probably saying to yourself right now, well, those are the 2 exact same things. You just said the exact same words. Right, but I'm referencing as the first addiction with a capital A and the second addiction with a little a. So the addiction with the big A references the actual addiction. So the addiction to alcohol and drugs, gambling. And the second addiction with the little a is how the media portrays addiction, or how society portrays addiction in kind of a weird, funky way. And what I mean by that is, like, sometimes you'll hear someone say, man, I am addicted to these cookies. Or, man, I am really addicted to this apple pie. I can't stop eating it. But are you really? Are you really addicted to it? Is it really causing you problems in your life right now? Are you experiencing withdrawal symptoms? Do you have a strong craving when you wake up in the morning for an apple pie? You know, there's a huge difference between the two, and I think it's important that we understand the difference. And actually put more focus and energy into the first addiction with the capital A, and change the wording for the second part, because realistically, you can't get addicted to cookies. I mean, unless you're the cookie monster, who probably, had a serious problem with eating cookies. But in reality, a lot of people do not get addicted to cookies or brownies or apple pie, or watching their favorite Netflix show, or anything like that. So I just wanted to point that out, that there's a huge distinction between those 2 words. And I'm going to get back into the wording part of it here later on this podcast. But the next thing I wanted to talk about was the actual signs and symptoms of addiction, because that was one of the 4 main factors of what makes up a disease. So if I were to ask you, what are some signs and symptoms of somebody who's experiencing Alzheimer's disease? Well, they're probably forgetting, where they put their items. Maybe they get lost every now and then in a familiar place. Tend to forget people's names, things like that. With addiction, some examples of signs and symptoms of addiction include health issues, financial issues, mental health, such as depression, anxiety increases, job loss, legal issues, relationship issues, homelessness, cravings, increased tolerance, etc., etc. There's a lot more. And what happens is that a disease goes through 3 different stages. So the first stage is called the early, the second stage is middle, and the third stage is called late. And so the early stage of the disease of addiction, an individual is, at least for the most part, experimenting with the drug, experimenting with alcohol. And I think a lot of people actually get into this stage at an early age, between the ages of 12 to 18. We're out there, we're with some friends, we're around a campfire, having a couple of drinks, having a good time. And some of the signs and symptoms of this stage is there's really not a whole lot. There's really no real legal issues. The tolerance is typically low. There's minimal health issues due to use. There's really no interference with job, school, or relationships. Although there might be some consequences, but not to the extent of where it would be considered in the middle stage of the disease. At this stage, in the early stage, we're experimenting, we're curious, there's some peer pressure going on. We still have loved ones that love us. So, in a nutshell, the signs and symptoms in the early stage, there really is no huge impact on life. And it really isn't until we hit the middle stage of diseases when we start experimenting or experiencing some signs and symptoms. So, for example, once we hit the middle stage, we begin to notice a tolerance increase. So instead of 1 drink or 2 drinks getting us intoxicated, it now takes maybe 8 or 9. There might be some minor legal issues involved now. So maybe we got a DUI. Maybe we got a possession charge, maybe a public intox. We begin to hang around with people that we use with. So, and what I mean by that is we begin to isolate ourselves from our family and our friends, and we begin to hang around those people that use the same substance as us. So we're involved with a very tight-knit group of people. We may begin to experience some mental health issues such as depression, anxiety. We might be experiencing some job issues. So maybe we're on our last warning at work because we've always come in late. Or maybe we're not giving 100% because we're, coming down from the substance. But we're on the verge of losing our jobs. Relationship issues. So we might experience a friction in relationships, whether it would be with our significant other, family members, or true friends who are starting to wonder, what's going on with him or her. They're not hanging around with us anymore. They're hanging out with so and so more often. They begin to show some concern. Another thing is that we start experiencing withdrawal symptoms. So things like chills, tremors, hangovers, nausea, body aches, sometimes insomnia, fatigue, restlessness, agitation, irritability. And it's different for each drug. And at this point, we begin to experience cravings. And cravings was one of the things that we talked about in the last episode, but a craving is a strong physical urge to use a substance. And in most cases, it may involve the having the taste of the substance in your mouth, or severe preoccupation, or spending a lot of time thinking about using the drug. So maybe you're at work, it's only 11 o'clock in the morning, you keep looking at your clock, wishing it was 5 o'clock so you can go out and get high or drunk. And so those are some of the basic signs and symptoms in the middle stage of the disease of addiction. And now I'm going to turn our focus into the late stage. And this is when things really begin to take a toll on our health. So at the late stage, we begin to experience severe mental health issues. So this is severe depression, severe anxiety. Suicidal ideation becomes very common at this stage, as well as suicide itself. And it's very sad to see, because what happens is we get into this vicious cycle of using and stopping, and then eventually we become isolated, and we tend to have a lot of struggle with getting out of that vicious cycle. It's like fish in a dam. If you ever gone to a dam and seen fish jump in and out of the water, they can't get out of the dam because the current's so strong. And that's kind of like what we're experiencing, because we also begin to experience increased health issues, physical issues. We begin to see new diseases being developed. So if you have an addiction to alcohol, you may begin to develop cirrhosis of the liver. Perhaps you use methamphetamine. And one of the things about methamphetamine is that it depletes our dopamine. And if we continue depleting our dopamine over time, that could be a cause for Parkinson's disease. And another thing is that with methamphetamine use, we tend to stay up for a long period of time. And when we sleep, it's kind of like a windshield wiper in our brain. It cleans out all the plaque and all the cavities out in our brain when we sleep. So when we don't sleep, that plaque and those cavities continue to build. And as it builds, that is also a case that could be developed into Alzheimer's disease. Some other things that we experience is complete isolation. So now we start staying away from those that we used to use with, and we just want to use on our own. Family members, loved ones begin to give up on us. And we might be homeless at this point or couch surfing, but we really don't have an actual physical address where we live at. We probably don't have a job at this point, which leads to poor financial stability. There's usually severe legal issues, so we're talking about federal crimes, long-term prison sentences, and like I said, little to no support. So when we begin to feel all these signs and symptoms, that's a lot to carry. And that's a really hard thing to get out of. So the goal is, if we're using or early in recovery, the goal is that we don't ever enter that late stage of the disease. Because that's going to be complete hell. So my next question is, if we were to zoom in on the early middle stage of the disease, and I'll have this diagram up on my YouTube channel at Real Addiction Talk, so that you can have a better understanding of what I'm saying, because the disease concept of addiction is a very hard thing to understand. This is something that you could probably fit into a semester's worth of learning, and I'm trying to wrap it up in a 30-minute podcast. But I'm going to use the example of Joe, and let's say Joe gets into the middle stage of the addiction. Can Joe, after a period of sobriety, let's say 5 years, begin using again and actually stay in the early stage and never go back to the middle stage? Well, if you answered no, that's correct. It's just going to be a matter of time until Joe goes right back into the middle stage of the disease. It might be a week or two. He might be able to control his use for a week or two, but he's going to go right back into that middle stage. He's going to go right back to where he left off. Because what happens is, once we cross that threshold between the early and the middle stage of the disease, that's when the actual disease becomes triggered. And it's different for everybody. It could be at an early age where you trigger the disease. Or you might not even trigger the disease at all. You have people who've been smoking for 50, 60 years and they never develop lung cancer. So it's different for everybody. But once we do cross that threshold, that's when the actual disease becomes triggered. And at that point, there's no turning back. Because now it's chronic, now it's progressive, it's incurable, and we're going to begin experiencing some signs and symptoms. So if there's one thing I want you to understand out of this whole sequence of events, is that no, we cannot stay in the early stage of the disease if we have a period of sobriety and begin using again. And a lot of people had this mindset, this confidence that they can have just one drink, one hit, and be okay, because they think they have it under control. And that's so misleading and so dangerous. Because what tends to happen is that our mind begins to play tricks on us when we're sober. Whether it be a year, 5 years, or 10 years, 20 plus years, our mind will play tricks on us. And we become somewhat confident in our use. So we say to ourselves, I can have just one. Go out to the bar and have one, which like what I said before, this may work for a week or two. But Joe is going to go right back into the middle stage, where he's going to begin experiencing health issues, mental health issues, legal issues, family issues. And if it's not controlled properly, if it's not managed appropriately, Joe will go into the late stage of the disease. And that's what we're trying to avoid. And there's two major factors that determine who becomes addicted and who doesn't. And the first one is genetics. And this really makes up about 85% of the reason why people become addicted to a substance, is because of the genetic part of it. So if, for example, let's say your mom has an addiction, but your dad doesn't, the chances of you becoming addicted to something is 50%. And if both parents have it, then the chances of you getting it is 85%. And I know a lot of you are thinking, well, wouldn't it be 100%? Not exactly, because there's a lot of factors that go into it. And like I said before, not everybody develops the disease. And this is why, and some of you out there who are listening to this probably are experiencing this, is, you're the black sheep of the family. You're the only one who has an addiction, and your sisters and brothers do not. And that's because you received the genetic tendency to develop the disease of addiction while your siblings did not. So not everybody develops the disease. Just like anybody who eats a lot of sugar won't develop diabetes. Not everybody who gets HIV will develop AIDS. Not everybody who's going to smoke cigarettes is going to develop lung cancer. It's all based on the genetic factor. Do we carry that genetic factor in our genes, in our DNA? The second part is the environmental factor. And the environment is where we grow up in and surround ourselves, because that can greatly influence whether or not an addiction develops and becomes a disease. So if we grew up in a broken home, or if we grew up with our parents getting drunk or high every day, arguing with each other, if we attend a school that doesn't really provide prevention measures for using drugs and alcohol, if we experience trauma as a kid, and this is one of the biggest reasons why people develop an addiction is because of trauma as a kid. Because what tends to happen is that, the kid might experience some type of traumatic event, whether it be abuse, verbally, sexually, and they carry that with them through their childhood because they probably didn't receive the appropriate mental health services or talk therapy to help recover from that. And what you'll find is that once they hit the age around 12, 13, 14, they find a drug. Their best friend says, "Hey, take a hit, take a drink." And what they experience is, "Oh, wow, I feel good. I can numb myself for a while and not think about the past or how my life is right now." And then, of course, over time, if they carry the genetic tendency, they'll develop the disease of addiction. And then the downward spiral will start. So there you have it, the two major factors that tends to develop the disease of addiction: genetics and environment. And I always sorry, I had to take a little drink of coffee there. But if you have an active addiction, I'm sure you've heard this question before. And I'm sure it drives you nuts. Absolutely nuts. But I'm sure you've heard the question, "Hey, why can't you just stop? Just stop using. What's wrong with you?" And you'll hear people say, "But isn't it their choice? They decided to use in the first place. They should suffer the consequences. They chose to use." And this is a quote that I found in a book as well. I'm gonna find the author of it and post it on my website. But he says, quote, "No one would choose to get addiction any more than they choose to get cancer. Addiction is a consequence of many contributing factors, including genetics, upbringing, trauma, and other influences. People with addiction are usually living pretty miserable lives and wouldn't choose to live that way if given the chance." Unquote. And that's powerful right there. That is a powerful quote. You think about it. No one in their right mind is going to wake up someday and say, "You know what? I think I'm going to get addicted to meth. Yeah, this seems like a great day to do that. Let's do it. Forget about my kids, forget about my family, forget about my job, forget about my physical health, forget about my mental well-being. I'm just going to try meth. I'm going to get addicted to it. I want to see what that lifestyle is like and just go with it." No one does that. No one wakes up in the morning and says, you know what, I think I'm going to try and develop cancer today. It doesn't happen that way. They did choose to use at the early stage of the disease. They chose to go out to the keg, do a cake stand, listen to some Tupac and Dr. Dre, maybe some Dave Matthews Band. I don't know what your preference is. But yeah, they chose to do that. But what they didn't choose and what they didn't know was that they carry the genetic tendency to develop the disease of addiction. And then what happens is they trigger the disease, and now it becomes the number one survival. It becomes the number one value in life. And what happens is after prolonged use, it changes the brain in fundamental ways. And so, if you honestly think that a mother of 3, despite having, that the Department of Human Services involved with their kid's life, is going to continue using because she loves the methamphetamine more than her kids, is ridiculous. She's using the methamphetamine because she's in survival mode. And she doesn't know how to stop. And she's not receiving the appropriate care to stop. Nor has she probably ever received any education about the disease concept of addiction, or learned about coping mechanisms or the sequence of use. So what happens is they take her kids away, and then she's going to continue using even more. And this impacts the kids' mental health because now they're not around their mother. And now they grow up and probably repeat the same behaviors. And I think that's something that's very important to understand is, and I'll get into that in a different episode, not today, but no one would choose a drug or a substance over anything else in their life. It's just that when they trigger the disease, that becomes the number one survival thing that they're focused on. It's above eating, it's above a job, it's above everything. And that's where treatment becomes very important. And there are some people out there that can quit using for good without any treatment experience, but for the most part, a lot of people need to receive treatment because they need to be educated about this type of information. And I compare it to like breaking a leg. If you were to break a leg, one of the first things that occurs is that you become educated about the broken leg and how to manage it properly so that it heals, right? You receive casts and crutches to prevent re-injury to the leg. You receive physical therapy to regain strength and flexibility. And I'm comparing this to addiction treatment, by the way. When we develop an addiction, we enter treatment, we regain the education about the disease. We receive coping skills, lifestyle skills to prevent use. We enter a treatment sequence of maybe residential care, followed up with outpatient care, followed up with continuing care. Family and friends are there to help you and to keep your morale up. And then eventually the bone heals and it's back to normal life. But the leg may be more vulnerable to breaking again if not taken care of properly. Just like with addiction, if we're more vulnerable to use again if it's not managed correctly in recovery. And another thing I want to add to that is that the longer you stay in treatment, the better the success rate is for recovery. A lot of treatment programs have like a 7-week program where we come to group sessions maybe twice a week, and an individual session maybe once every week or two. And then after the 7 weeks, it's adios. Good luck. And what happens again is that we end up seeing them again because they didn't receive the actual structure or support that they needed after treatment. So the longer you're in treatment, the better the success rate is for you. And I wanted to mention as well, and this is another important wording factor with addiction, and that is there's a huge difference between the word lapse and relapse. And a lot of times when we're in treatment and we have a slip up or we have a day of use, depending on which treatment center you go to, either A, they'll put you on a treatment contract and say, hey, if you use again, you're going to residential or you're going straight to jail. Or you see it as a one-time use and you get back on track. And the difference between a lapse and relapse is this. A lapse is a one-time occurrence. However, after that one-time occurrence, you get back on track. You become honest with the ones that you love that you used. You're open about it. You continue to work the program and you get right back on track. That's a lapse. A relapse is going right back to your old behaviors. And unfortunately, a relapse could last another 5, 10, 15 years of your life. So it's important to understand that if you have a lapse, that's okay. Don't get down on yourself. Because we need to avoid the actual relapse, because that's going to take out another 15 years of your life. So understanding the difference between the two is critical in recovery. You know, we have to avoid relapse. If we have a lapse, be honest about it, continue working the program, don't get down on yourself, and learn from what happened. You know, write down in a journal the events that led up to the use so that you understand what occurred and you can do it differently next time. There was two studies done with mice. One was done in the 1970s, and what this study was about was they would put a mouse in a cage by itself, and they would have two bottles in it. One would be just water, and the other one would be cocaine. And what they found was that when the mouse experienced cocaine for the first time, it would almost always go back to the cocaine. It would die relatively quick. But when you put a mouse in sort of like, it's called the rat park study, by the way. You put the mouse in this rat park, which is a cage full of other mice, and you put two bottles in there, one full of water and one full of cocaine. What you'll find is that the mice will hardly ever touch the cocaine. And if they did, it was only just a little bit. And the reason being is because of that bonding with the other mice. The social structure that, you know, through humanity, we as humans depend on bonding and love from others. And when we don't have that in our lives, we're going to bond with something else, whether it be alcohol or drugs. And so having that social support is going to greatly benefit you recovering from this disease. And the other mouse study was that what they found was that they had a mouse. And if you ever seen a mouse in your house, I sound like Dr. Seuss there. But if you've ever seen a mouse in your house and you turn on the lights when it's dark out, what you'll find is that you'll see like this dart, this fast reaction from something on the floor, because the mouse is quickly going somewhere where it's dark because the light turned on, and now they have to go somewhere that's safe. You know, because they're getting eaten by owls and other animals. They quickly go into the dark. But what they found was that if you got a mouse to try cocaine and you turn on the lights, the mouse wouldn't care about getting into the dark. The mouse would actually risk its life to go out and get the cocaine when the light is on. And that's how powerful addiction is. Willing to risk your life for the substance. And this wasn't a one-time study thing. This was with a lot of mice going out and risking their lives to get the cocaine, despite knowing the fact that they'll probably die getting after it. But again, that's the power of the disease of addiction. I covered quite a bit today, and I could go on for hours about this. But unless you're driving from New York to Los Angeles, this could easily be divided up into different segments. But that's it. The disease concept of addiction, in a summary, pretty much. I do want you to check out the website, realaddictiontalk.com. And I'll have a lot of resources and references and information for you about the disease concept of addiction. And I will have other podcasts moving forward about this subject. And if you do have any questions, if you have any comments, maybe you have a story, maybe you have a loved one that's suffering with addiction, but whatever it may be, feel free to contact us at Real Addiction Talk on Facebook. Get a hold of us on our website. We're on several different social media outlets: Twitter, Instagram, the WhatsApp app, Telegram, and you can find all those websites on our website. But feel free to reach out, ask questions. And again, if you're currently suffering with an addiction, or you're in recovery, or if you're an expert in the field, jump on our website and go to the Be a Guest tab and fill out the form. We're definitely looking for people to be a guest on our show. And I also wanted to remind you that we also have our membership up and running, which is called the Rat Pack. And the reason for that is because RAT stands for Real Addiction Talk. But for $5 a month, what you'll get as a member is you'll get a PDF copy of the host's notes, outline, and research, and transcription of the episode. You'll also receive additional content, resources, information on our website through the members only page, which is password protected. You'll receive a shout out on one of our episodes and on our Facebook page and on our website. And one lucky winner per month will receive the actual host outline, notes, and transcription signed by yours truly and delivered straight to your address for free. And there's a lot more perks as well for being a member. Well, again, I want to thank you for joining me today on our second episode of Real Addiction Talk. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of the month of September. And we'll see you again here in a couple weeks for episode 3. Thank you.
And